You're listening to Hoedown History, where we explore the history and legends of America's old-time and bluegrass music. What they call a chestnut tune, and for many folk musicians of all instruments, it commonly appears as maybe one of the first 10 or so beginner tunes you find in lesson books and instructional videos. It's a popular tune found in many different regions. It turns up basically everywhere from the deep south to the southwest, from contra dance bands in the northeast to both Cajun and Canadian string bands as well. And it's even listed as one of Missouri's essential state fiddle tunes. It even turns up in that great old-timey film, Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, where it's played on hammered dulcimer in that fight scene at the pub with Leonardo DiCaprio. So stick around because we're going to explore the history of this tune, along with the man who made its first recording. This one was a bit of a surprise to me when I found out who it was. And stick around till the end because we'll even discuss where this tune may have ultimately come from. The title should give you some type of clue as to its origins. So let's dive in. If you do a basic Google or Wikipedia search for the earliest recording of this tune, you'll be directed to Fiddlin John Carson, who recorded Liberty in 1925, followed by some other recordings by Gid Tanner and his Skillet Lickers and Herschel Brown in 1928. Okay, that's not too surprising, right? But here's the thing. Those versions are in fact a completely different tune than the more popular versions of Liberty we're discussing. If we look for the first actual recording of the more popular version, it doesn't pop up on a record until 1947, which is a lot more recent than I first assumed. What's even more surprising is who first recorded it. It's not found in some Skillet Lickers issue or some old Appalachian or Ozark field recording. Nope. The person we can thank for the first recording and for popularizing this tune is this man, the legendary Texas fiddler Bob Wills, also known as the King of Western Swing. While Wills is better known today for pioneering the slick sounds of Western swing with super large bands that would perform many popular numbers of the time, many people forget that Bob's music was steeped in the tradition of old-time fiddling. Bob Wills was born James Robert Wills on a cotton farm in Cosey, Texas, in 1905. He came from a long line of fiddlers. Both grandfathers, 9 uncles, and 5 aunts all played fiddle. His father, John Thompson, was sort of a legend in his own right. He was better known as Uncle John Wills throughout Texas, where he won a popular reputation playing at ranch dances and fiddling contests. Legend has it that he even beat Eck Robertson at one of these competitions. When Bob was born, family stories recount that when his father picked up his newborn son for the first time, he said, quote, "I'll make a fiddler out of you, son." His brother-in-law, who was standing by his side, looked at the baby's hand and added, "Well, he'll make a better fiddler than you, Johnny. Look at them long fingers." When Bob was 8 years old, the family moved by covered wagon to Hall County in western Texas, where he shortly learned his very first fiddle tune. According to Wills, one afternoon, his 35-year-old cousin Alford was trying to learn to play a simple tune called Goodbye Liza Jane. I guess Alford was struggling a bit because at one point Bob's father had enough of the noise and told Alford that he thought Bob, who was 9 years old at the time, could play it better. His cousin looked at Bob and said, "Son, if you can play it any better, I'll take this fiddle and bust it over the foot of the bed." The instrument was handed over to Bob, who proceeded to play the tune beautifully and with ease before handing it back to his cousin. And of course, true to his word, Alford walked over to the bedside and busted that fiddle into 1,000 pieces. But Bob's father wasn't the only one to instruct him in music. His grandfather, Tom Wills, had also moved to West Texas with the clan, and one day he was determined to instruct young Bob in the intricacies of bowing technique. His brother Johnny Lee recounted how he and Bob were always instructed to use the longbow. One day Bob was in his room fiddling, but just using a little bit of the bow. His grandfather came into the room and took the bow from him and put it away, saying, "Till you actually learn how to use it, don't pick it up anymore." Shortly thereafter, he went back into the room and said to Bob, quote, "Listen, if that full bow wasn't meant to be used, it wouldn't have been made that long." Bob learned his lesson, and from there on, he pulled the long bow. As he grew up, Bob would accompany his father and grandfather when they went to play at ranch dances in the area. He often played mandolin behind his father's fiddle, and in later years, Bob recounted the hard work and drudgery that came from these outings. After a full day of working at his family's farm, they would often go to some local ranch to play music, and the sessions would go on all night long. Around midnight, they would usually take a quick break for supper, and then just keep on playing. Sometimes during the music, he would drop his mandolin pick, but keep on going until his fingers would eventually rip open and the blood would start running down his instrument. Supposedly, many years later, Bob still had the scars on his fingers to prove the fact. Because these ranch dances would be pretty hard on a little kid like Bob, when he got back home, he would sometimes go to his mother crying, and in one instance even told her that when he grew up, he would never set foot in a dance hall for as long as he lived. His mother replied, quote, "It don't pay to say what you won't do, 'cause you're liable to wind up doing that very thing." Along with the lessons of hard work and discipline that Bob learned from playing in these dances, he also picked up some other valuable experiences that he would carry throughout his later career, and that were essential in developing his unique sound. Will spent much time working in the cotton fields of East and West Texas, where he got to experience and learn the blues and jazz sounds from black coworkers and playmates. He would eventually combine these sounds with the fiddle music he learned from his family members. The blues would add some heat and color to these old-time fiddle numbers, and the jazz influence would help give it that swing. In fact, some have referred to Bob's music not just as Western swing, but as Western jazz. Another thing he picked up during this time is his famous trademark aha cry that you'll hear on basically every one of his recordings. The story, as recounted by Wills, goes that when he and his father would go to these ranch dances to play and the rest of the band would start dragging in the middle of a tune, his father would yell out, "Get up, boys," to help give them some more pep. Bob claims that he just came up with his particular aha phrase accidentally one night, but it would stick around for his entire career. The other thing Bob learned during his childhood was a wider repertoire of the old-time fiddle tunes that were floating around the Texas Fiddle Contest during those days. And not just the tunes themselves, but his actual fiddle was also picked up at one of these contests when his father won one of these instruments at one of the competitions. As Bob recalled, it was a cheap little fiddle, but it happened to be a great cheap fiddle. The handle and neck were actually a fraction shorter than a standard size, which luckily meant it was easier for his smaller fingers to play. This would be Bob's first ever fiddle that he actually owned, and it's still on view at the Country Music Hall of Fame today. As Bob developed his fiddling, he also developed as a person. Eventually, he went through a stage of gospel preaching, did a stint at a medicine show, singing and doing blackface routines, and even attended a barber college in Amarillo. For a time, he had a band in New Mexico that included some Mexican-American musicians. He also became a huge fan of the blues, and in particular Bessie Smith, whom he adored, sometimes traveling for miles just to see her in concert. In October of 1929, about the same time the stock market was crashing, the Brunswick Record Company had set up a field recording session in Dallas. After the company had finished recording a host of popular Texas bands and musicians, they decided to make a couple of test records of a pair of musicians identifying themselves as Jim Rob Wills and Herman Arnspiger. It was Bob Wills, of course, and these were his first ever records. But unfortunately, we'll never know what they sounded like because they were never released. and the metal parts for the masters were apparently destroyed in 1956. By 1930, Wills and his guitar player, Arnsperger, a cotton worker, whom he had met at a medicine show, were calling themselves the Wills Fiddle Band, and they were playing around the Fort Worth area. Eventually, they would join forces with a young singer named Milton Brown. Brown is also considered one of the premier pioneers of Western swing as well, and together they were called the Light Crust Doughboys. They found jobs working on the new medium of radio and started playing over KFJZ in Fort Worth. Wills and his band were a hit, and in the late summer of 1933, Wills left the Doughboys and formed a new band that soon became known as the Texas Playboys. He came up with the name in an effort to provide an alternative to the more hillbilly image of the other contemporary musicians like Uncle Dave Macon and the Carter family. During these years in Tulsa, Wills continued to develop that swinging Western jazz sound he had pioneered in West Texas. Along with this newer style of music, he also outfitted his band in matching uniforms and would eventually incorporate drums and horns. This allowed for the ability of the band to perform everything from jazz to blues to fiddle breakdowns, cementing a mashup style of music that would eventually be called Western swing. He debuted over a radio station in Waco, but then moved to Tulsa, where KVOO had one of those powerful 50,000-watt stations which could be heard far and wide. And it was during his time here that Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys became the most popular act in the entire Southwest United States. With the strength of his popularity on the radio and recordings, Hollywood even came calling in 1940. In that year, Bob and the boys headed out to California to make some westerns with Tex Ritter and Glenn Ford. From 1935 to 1947, Wills and his band would enjoy their greatest success and go on to record for numerous record labels. These recordings sold in the hundreds of thousands, and his most popular number, San Antonio Rose, sold somewhere in the millions. Of the more than 200 recordings from 1929 to 42, Wills and the Texas Playboys recorded some 200 sides. Of these, not more than a quarter were classic fiddle tunes, of the sort that his father played, and that showed up at Texas fiddling contests. One of the ones that did show up was a tune that had never been recorded before, but would eventually go on to become a classic for grassroots fiddlers throughout the country. Liberty was first recorded in 1942 for the Columbia label in Hollywood, California, right after the filming was complete. But with America entering World War II that same year, the records would not be released until 1947. So here's a recording of Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys playing Liberty, and it's just great. After Wills' recording was released in 1947, another version of the tune was recorded 8 years later, but this time in Canada, by the legendary fiddler Don Messer in 1953. I've covered Messer in my Whiskey Before Breakfast video, so you can watch that one for more info on this musician. And here's Messer's recording of Liberty, or what he called the Liberty Two-Step. It's nearly identical to Bob Wills' version, but with a little less Texas swing and a bit more Canadian hop. Soon after Messer's recording, a host of other Canadian bands would carry this tune even farther, but interesting enough, more commonly under a different title. Just 2 years after Messer's Liberty, the popular Montreal-based group led by Bob Hill recorded the tune, which featured the Keranen brothers as well. Here's his recording of the tune. What's also interesting about this recording is that Bob Hill didn't title his tune Liberty. He called it Réalité Jean, which derived from Jean Carignan, whose nickname was T. Jean. This title would stick, and many Canadian bands would go on to perform and record this tune under this title, not just in Canada. This tune would eventually cross the Atlantic, where it ended up in the British Isles, with a play on the Canadian title. Once in the British Isles, the tune went from Réalité Jean to Little John's Reel. But in America, another legendary fiddler would make a recording of Liberty that would help further popularize it to an even wider audience during the folk revival of the 50s and 60s. The famous Nashville studio musician Tommy Jackson recorded Liberty in 1954. His version is played with more of a straight-ahead square dance rhythm, and it's also pretty wonderful.
Here's Tommy Jackson with the fine old fiddle tune of Liberty.
Jackson's records were picked up and copied by many American musicians during the 1950s and 60s. Another legendary early recording was made in 1959 by the North Carolina fiddler Marcus Martin. It's a bit different in feel, but I'll have to share it with you. Marcus Martin was born in Macon County, North Carolina in 1881. As a child, he learned to fiddle from his father, who was half Cherokee, and also from the Cherokee fiddler Manco Sneed. Martin began performing publicly at a young age, often providing music for square dances in Macon and Cherokee counties, usually without any accompaniment. Like many rural musicians in the southern Appalachians, Martin played various instruments, including banjo and harmonica, and also sang ballads. As a young man, he tried various jobs, including working for a dry goods company, filing saws for loggers, and serving as a postmaster in the 1920s. Martin gained most of his fame as a fiddler after Bascom Lamar Lunsford founded the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival in nearby Asheville in 1928. He became a favorite of Lunsford and was called upon to open every festival with a performance of his tune Gray Eagle. He won the Old Timey Fiddlers Convention Championship at the North Carolina State Fair in Raleigh in 1949 and again in 1950, before eventually withdrawing from competition. By this time, Martin had already attracted the attention of folklorists, who made a large number of field recordings of his playing in the 40s and 50s. The last person to visit Marcus and make some field recordings was one Peter Hoover, who remembered that the only things that Martin had in his refrigerator were some soda crackers and bottles of moonshine. So here's Marcus Martin's legendary recording of Liberty, which, unlike the previous recordings I played, is a bit less smooth and crisp. It's a more raw sound, straight from the mountains of North Carolina, and it's simply mesmerizing. After Tommy Jackson's recording of Liberty, it was just kind of a matter of time until the tune started popping up with other old-time revival and bluegrass bands in the decades to follow, most famously with the Dillards in 1963, and even more importantly in 1967, with these guys. It was released on an album entitled Flatt and Scruggs with Doc Watson, strictly instrumental, What's surprising about this record is that it almost never happened. It's an almost forgotten story that I uncovered that was passed down by the musician David Holt, who used to perform with Doc Watson during the early 2000s. David recounted how in 1966, Flatt and Scruggs invited Doc to record an album with them. Doc and Merle traveled to Nashville and stayed at a motel the day before the recording was scheduled to start. That next morning, when Doc woke up, he was feeling sick. Very, very sick. Earl insisted that they go see a doctor, which they did. After examining Watson, the doctor immediately sent him to the hospital. It turned out Doc had a ruptured appendix. At one point, things were looking pretty bad because the doctors gave Watson just a 5% chance of surviving. But eventually, he was able to make a recovery. But Doc was extremely worried about the medical bills he had piled up. At this time in life, Doc was not the super well-known musician we know of today, and he didn't have a lot of money. In fact, he told Earl that he, quote, didn't even have a nickel to his name. And although he wasn't a very close friend of Scruggs at the time, Earl went to bat for him. He went to the folks at the Opry Fund to explain Doc's situation and made a case that they should chip in and help this fine young musician from North Carolina. The funds were secured, and Doc recovered, after which they were able to record this now classic album, which included a version of Liberty that would be copied by countless bluegrass musicians in the decades to follow. I wasn't able to get permission for this actual recording, so here's a live recording of Doc Watson playing Liberty in 1990. Doc was forever grateful to Earl for helping him during this scary time. Quick side note, when Doc was well enough to leave the hospital, Earl actually flew him home in his plane, and he even let Doc try his hand at flying. I could make a joke about flying blind or something like that, but I won't. After all of this, Doc and Earl became good friends for life. So that's basically how Liberty made its way into the modern folk repertoire. But the question remains, where in fact did it actually come from? And this is where things get a bit unclear, because while Bob Wills appears to be the first to ever make a recording of the tune, we don't really know for sure where he learned it from. Some have speculated that he may have gotten it from his father, who taught him many old-time tunes, but this has never been fully confirmed. Some have even suggested that the tune was originally an old Canadian tune all along, before entering the States at some point in history. But I wasn't able to pull up any firm research to support this claim either. But there is another theory. As I dug a little bit deeper, I found that there are some music historians that have linked this tune up to an old song that dates to around, as you may have guessed, the time of America's War of Independence. It was a song that was first published way back in 1768 by John Dickinson, and the title is actually basically the same. It was entitled The Liberty Song, which does lend this theory a good bit of weight. Dickinson was one of America's founding fathers and served in the First Continental Congress. While he composed this tune about a decade before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, it became popular as one of the earliest patriotic songs throughout the 13 colonies. The song's lyrics were updated in 1770 in order to reflect the then growing tensions between England and the colonies. These lyrics even contain the earliest known publication of the phrase that parallels the motto, "United we stand, divided we fall." So I'll play the fiddle tune Liberty, followed by the Liberty Song, and see if you can make out any similarity between the two. Remember, the more recent folk version is going to be a bit different, as it's basically a tune made for dancing, and the earlier version is written as a patriotic ballad.
swallow your bumpers, ye Tories, and roar that the sons of their freedom are hampered once more. In freedom we're born, like sons of the brave. We'll never surrender, but swear to defend her. And scorn to survive if unable to save.
So there is some similarity here, in both the title and in parts of the melody. And the story for our source doesn't actually end here. Dickinson didn't just get this melody out of thin air. In fact, the music for his Liberty song was taken from the melody of the English song entitled Heart of Oak. This piece was composed by Dr. William Boyce in 1759. It was originally written for the London stage, but eventually became the official march of the Royal Navy, the oak in the title referring to the wood used in the royal warships of the time. As the melody is basically identical to the Liberty song, I don't really need to play a recording of this one. But our story doesn't end here either, because some have suggested that Dr. William Boyce didn't just get this tune from thin air either. Some researchers have in fact pointed out that the tune bears a strong resemblance to an old Irish and Scottish tune entitled Here's a Health to the Company. While there isn't much research to back up the claim that this tune is the predecessor of Heart of Oak, and it may in fact be derived from it for all we know, it does sound older, at least to my ears. I'll play both Liberty followed by Here's a Health, and see if you can make out any similarity.
Kind friends and companions, come join me in rhyme. Come lift up your voices in chorus with mine. Let us drink and be merry, all grief to refrain. For we may and might never all meet here again. So here's a health to the company, and one to my lass. Let us drink and be merry, all out of one glass. Let us drink and be merry, all grief to refrain. For we may and might never all meet here again.
Well, it's an interesting theory for a source, and obviously the tune will inevitably be a bit different, as it may have migrated from a traditional folk tune into a patriotic march, back into another traditional folk tune. But it's a cool theory anyway, and I'll leave you folks to decide for yourselves. Just months after Will's recording of Liberty in 1942, he joined the Army when he was 37 years old and served for a brief period during World War II, before receiving a medical discharge in the summer of 1943, after which he moved to California to reorganize the band. After the war, Wills continued to be popular on his radio shows and at dance halls, where he got paid enormous fees. By 1944, the Wills Band would include up to 23 members. His dances were drawing larger crowds than Tommy Dorsey and Benny Goodman. He was even invited to play at the Grand Ole Opry in 1944, under one stipulation. According to Opry policy, drums and horns were considered pop instruments and inappropriate to country music. The Opry had two Western swing bands on its roster at the time, led by Pee Wee King and Paul Howard, but neither was allowed to use their drummers at the Opry. Wills didn't submit easily. he battled the Opry officials and refused to perform without his drummer. Finally, a compromise was reached to just keep the drums hidden behind a curtain. Bob agreed to do this, but at the last minute, seconds before the show would start, he moved the drums onto the stage and placed them front and center. But the big ride wouldn't last. Throughout the 1950s, Bob struggled with heavy drinking, poor health, and some financial problems, owing a hefty sum of back taxes to the IRS. He continued to perform frequently, but by the mid-1950s, Western swing was beginning to fall out of public favor. By this time, his style of music didn't fit with the typical music that was being played on most country music stations, and neither did it fit in with the conventional sound of most pop stations. His recordings weren't doing the same business either. Times were changing. With the advent of television and rock and roll, fewer and fewer were going to the dance halls. When asked by an interviewer during this time about the competition from rock, Wills replied a bit confused, saying, "Rock and roll? Why, man, that's the same type of music we've been playing since 1928. And he wasn't all that crazy for saying this, as he backed up his claim that he was one of the first to incorporate electric guitars and drums into his rhythm section. And if you listen to his earlier recordings from the 30s and 40s, they do sound a bit like early rock and roll from the 50s. After suffering 2 heart attacks during the early 60s, Bob Wills disbanded the Texas Playboys in 1964. He continued to issue some solo recordings, but they were largely ignored. Wills was married 6 times over his lifetime, including one wife who happened to be the widow of Milton Brown. He remained married to his final wife, whom he married in 1942 until his death. Bob Wills had 6 children. In 1969, the governor and legislature of Texas honored Wills for his contribution of Western swing to American music, one of the few original music forms Texas and the Southwest has produced. But the day after the ceremonies in Austin, Wills had the first in a series of crippling strokes. By 1973, his health had improved to the extent that he could still lead some of his former Texas Playboys in a recording session when they made an album that sold more copies than any other in Wills' career and was eventually awarded a Grammy. Wills died on May 13, 1975, but even after his death, he continued to receive some attention. In 1999, Bob Wills was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's one of the few persons inducted into both the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And if you're ever in Turkey, Texas, where Wills spent much of his early years, you can visit the Bob Wills Museum and Monument. While Wills is mostly known for helping to develop the slick sounds of Western swing, we shouldn't forget that he never lost his love for old-time fiddling. As late as 1964, when Wills broke up the Texas Playboys, he was able to go back into the studio. On this run, he could play pretty much whatever he wanted. He picked his old sideman, Sleepy Johnson, to accompany him during this session, who had joined him some 29 years before. Together, they cut an album that would feature not the newer pop tunes, but a bunch of the fiddle classics, like Billy and the Lowground, Big Taters and the Sandy Land, and the Beaumont Rag, a host of old-time tunes that he remembered and were always dear to his heart. So folks, that's all I got on Liberty, but I'll leave you all with one more classic recording. It's a live performance of the tune performed by Bob Wills himself, and it's just great. Hope you enjoyed this one, and thanks for listening.